The air out here was different. It did not smell like the exhaust fumes and desperation of the city. It smelled like cedar pine and wet earth. I had spent 15 years staring at a computer screen in a cubicle that felt more like a coffin. Every morning I would wake up and wonder if this was all life had to offer. Then the inheritance cleared. My grandfather left me a sprawling ranch in the heart of the valley. It was 300 acres of pure freedom. No neighbors within a mile. No traffic. No buses. Or so I thought. The day I pulled up to the rusted iron gates, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I spent the first week fixing the porch and clearing out the dust of a decade. But on the 8th day the peace was shattered. I was hauling old lumber to the barn when a white luxury SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of my property line. A woman stepped out before the engine even stopped. She was dressed in a pristine pastel suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the rugged hills. She did not say hello. She did not welcome me to the neighborhood. She simply marched toward me clutching a leather-bound clipboard like a weapon. I wiped the sweat from my brow and offered a polite nod. Before I could speak, she held up a hand to silence me. She introduced herself as Barbara, the president of the High Ridge Homeowners Association. I looked around at the vast empty hills and back at her. I told her I was pretty sure my ranch was independent land. She laughed a cold and hollow sound. She flipped through her pages and tapped a line with a manicured fingernail. She claimed that 20 years ago the previous owners had signed an easement agreement that brought this entire section of the valley under the jurisdiction of the HOA. I felt a knot form in my stomach. She then handed me a bright orange envelope. Inside was a bill for $30,000. She called them past dues. She said the ranch had been in violation of aesthetic codes for years. The peeling paint on the barn was a fine. The height of the grass was a fine. Even the rust on the gate was a fine. I told her I just got here. I told her I was not responsible for what happened while the place was sitting empty. Barbara leaned in close. She told me that the debt follows the land and not the person. She gave me 30 days to pay, or she would start the foreclosure process. I stood there stunned as she drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on my face. This was not the dream I was promised. This was a war. I spent the night looking through old files in the attic. I found the deed and the land surveys. There was no mention of an HOA. My grandfather was a stubborn man. He hated rules. There was no way he would have signed his soul away to a woman like Barbara. But as I dug deeper, I realized she had been doing this to others. The small farmers down the road were being squeezed out. She wanted the land for a new luxury golf development. I was the biggest obstacle in her path. I realized then that she did not just want the money. She wanted me gone. I looked out the window at the moonlit fields and made a silent vow. I would not lose this ranch. I would not let her win. The next morning I drove into town to find the oldest lawyer in the county. I needed someone who knew the history of this dirt. I needed a shark who understood the old ways. But when I mentioned Barbara, the lawyer's face turned pale. He told me she had the city council in her pocket. He told me to just pay the fine and move on. I walked out of his office and knew I was on my own. I went back to the ranch and started documenting everything. If Barbara wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I set up cameras at the gate. I started recording every interaction. A week later, she returned with a team of inspectors. They started walking onto my porch without permission. They were taking photos of my windows. They said my curtains were the wrong shade of beige. I told them to leave. Barbara stood on the driveway and screamed that I was a common criminal. She said I was lowering the property value of the entire valley. I laughed in her face. I told her the only thing lowering the value was her presence. That was the moment her face turned purple. She promised me that by the end of the month the bank would own my soul. I watched them leave and felt a chill. I knew she was not joking. She had the power and the connections. All I had was a pile of old papers and a ranch that was falling apart. But I also had something she did not. I had the truth. And in this valley, the truth buried deep in the soil eventually comes to light. I spent the next 3 days in the county records office. I went back 50 years. I found things Barbara thought were buried forever. I found the original charter. And then I found the mistake. The one tiny error that would change everything. But I could not show my hand yet. I had to let her think she was winning. I had to let her get comfortable in her greed. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for her to spring it. The pressure started to mount as the second week began. Barbara did not just send letters anymore. She sent contractors. One morning I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I ran outside to find a bulldozer idling at my fence line. A man in a hard hat told me they were there to widen the access road. He claimed the HOA had approved a project to improve the infrastructure of the valley. I stood in front of the machine and told him to turn it off. He looked at me with pity. He said he was just doing his job. I called the sheriff, but when he arrived, he just shook his head. He told me that the HOA had a valid permit. He said his hands were tied. I realized then how deep the corruption went. Barbara was using public resources to harass a private citizen. I stood my ground for 6 hours until the sun went down. The workers finally left, but they promised to be back at dawn. I spent that night in my truck parked across the driveway. I did not sleep. Every time a car drove past, I was on high alert. The next day, the fines started arriving by certified mail. $200 for an unauthorized vehicle parked in the driveway. $500 for obstructing a public works project. By noon, the total had climbed another $5,000. I went to the local diner to get some coffee, and the room went silent when I walked in. People looked away. They were afraid to be seen with me. The local shop owner whispered to me as I paid. He told me that Barbara had threatened to pull the business licenses of anyone who supported the rancher. She was a dictator in a floral dress. I went home and found my mailbox had been knocked over. My tires were slashed on the tractor. This was no longer about dues. This was about breaking my spirit. I spent the evening repairing the tractor and thinking about my grandfather. He always said that a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. I was standing for my home. I decided to go on the offensive. I used my drone to fly over the luxury development Barbara lived in. I wanted to see what she was hiding. What I found was a massive unpermitted guest house and a pool that violated the very same water restrictions she was citing against me. I took high-resolution photos of every violation on her own property. If she wanted to play by the rules, we were going to follow every single one of them. I printed the photos and mailed them to every member of the HOA board. I included a letter stating that as a member of the association, I was concerned about the leadership's blatant disregard for the codes. The reaction was immediate. My phone started ringing off the hook. Barbara called me screaming. She called me a stalker. She said she would get a restraining order. I told her I was just being a concerned neighbor. I told her I was worried about the property values. She hung up on me. That night, someone threw a brick through my front window. Attached to it was a note that said, "Leave or else." I did not call the police. I knew they would do nothing. Instead, I went to the local hardware store and bought the biggest spotlight they had. I mounted it on the roof and pointed it straight down the road. If anyone approached my house, they would be bathed in light. I stayed up with my grandfather's old rifle across my lap. I was not going to shoot anyone, but I wanted them to know I was ready. The next morning, the bulldozer returned. But this time they had a police escort. Barbara was there too, wearing a hard hat like she was some kind of general. She had a smirk on her face that made my blood boil. She handed me a paper. It was an emergency injunction. It ordered me to vacate the perimeter of the road construction or face arrest. I looked at the sheriff. He would not meet my eyes. I realized then that I could not win this with muscle. I had to use my brain. I stepped aside and let them start digging. But as the blade hit the dirt, I smiled. I knew something they did not. There was an old utility line buried there that was not on the modern maps. 10 minutes later, there was a loud hiss, and a fountain of water shot 50 feet into the air. The bulldozer had hit the main water line for the entire HOA subdivision. Barbara started screaming at the workers. The sheriff was scrambling to find a shutoff valve. I leaned against my porch railing and took a sip of water. I told them they were violating the Environmental Protection Act by causing a man-made flood on private property. The chaos lasted for hours. The luxury homes up the hill lost all water pressure. The residents were furious. They started driving down to see what was happening. They saw Barbara standing in the mud, looking like a fool. This was the first crack in her armor. The neighbors were starting to see that her vendetta against me was costing them their own comfort. I spent the rest of the day recording the angry residents yelling at her. I posted the videos online. By the evening, the video had 10,000 views. The headline was HOA President floods neighborhood to spite local rancher. The narrative was shifting. I was no longer the outsider. I was the victim of a power-hungry bureaucrat. But Barbara was not done. She went to the judge that night. She wanted me evicted immediately. She claimed I was a threat to public safety. I knew the next morning would be the final showdown. I gathered my documents and prepared for court. I had one card left to play, and it was an ace. The courtroom was packed. Every resident of the High Ridge HOA was there. Half of them wanted me gone, and the other half were tired of Barbara's tyranny. Barbara sat at the front table with a team of 3 lawyers. They looked like they cost more than my entire ranch. I sat alone at the defendant's table with my folder of old papers. The judge entered the room and looked at the mountain of filings. He looked tired. He asked Barbara's lawyer to present their case. For an hour, they laid out a narrative of a negligent property owner who refused to comply with community standards. They showed photos of my rusted gate and the tall grass. They claimed I owed $40,000 in dues and penalties. They argued that my refusal to pay was a breach of contract that entitled the HOA to seize the land. Then it was my turn. I stood up and walked to the podium. I did not start with the fines. I started with the history. I produced the original land grant from 1880. I showed the map of the valley before any houses were built. Then, I produced the document Barbara had used to claim my ranch was part of the HOA. It was a signed easement from 1995. I asked the court to look at the signature. It was my grandfather's name. But I then produced a death certificate. My grandfather had passed away in 1994, 1 year before the document was allegedly signed. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. I told the judge that the document was a forgery. I explained that Barbara's father had been the developer who started the HOA, and he had faked the records to make the development look larger than it was. He needed my ranch included to meet the minimum acreage for a luxury classification. Barbara's face went from pale to ghostly white. Her lawyers started whispering frantically. I did not stop there. I produced the soil reports from the area where the water line had broken. I showed that the HOA had been illegally dumping runoff onto my property for a decade. This had caused the erosion that led to the very code violations they were suing me for. I told the judge that the HOA did not just owe me an apology. They owed me for 10 years of land damage. The judge called for a recess. During the break, Barbara tried to corner me in the hallway. She offered to drop all the fines if I would just sign a new agreement. She was desperate. She told me I was ruining her life. I told her she had ruined her own life the moment she decided greed was more important than the truth. When we went back into the courtroom, the judge looked stern. He stated that based on the evidence of the forged signature, the ranch was never part of the HOA. He ruled that all past dues and fines were null and void. But he went further. He ordered an immediate investigation into the HOA's financial records. He wanted to know how many other properties had been brought into the association under false pretenses. As we walked out of the courtroom, the residents who had been glaring at me earlier were now surrounding Barbara. They wanted to know where their monthly fees were really going. It turned out she had been using the HOA treasury as her personal slush fund. She had paid for her luxury SUV and her designer suits with their money. I drove back to the ranch feeling like a weight had been lifted. The sheriff was waiting at my gate. He apologized for his behavior. He said he was just following orders, but he knew now that those orders were wrong. He helped me fix my mailbox. I spent the afternoon sitting on my porch, watching the sunset. For the first time in weeks, it was quiet. But the story was not over. Barbara was not going down without a fight. She had one last move. 2 days later, I received a notice from the State Environmental Board. They claimed my ranch was sitting on a protected wetland and that I had to cease all agricultural activity. This was Barbara's last gasp. She had used her connections in the state capital to try and freeze my land. If I could not farm, I could not pay the property taxes. If I could not pay the taxes, the state would take the land and sell it at auction. She was playing a long game now, but I had expected this. I had already reached out to a local university. I had invited their biology department to come out and do a real survey. They found something that Barbara never expected. They found an endangered species of wildflower that only grew on my ranch. This changed everything. Under federal law, the land was now a protected sanctuary. But because it was private property, I was the only one allowed to manage it. The state could not touch it. The development project Barbara wanted was officially dead. The golf course could not be built within 5 miles of a protected sanctuary. I had not just saved my ranch. I had saved the entire valley from being paved over. The fallout for Barbara was absolute. With the golf course project canceled, her investors pulled out. They sued her for misrepresentation. The HOA board was dissolved, and a new group of residents took over. They voted to refund a portion of the fees that had been collected under Barbara's reign. Barbara herself was forced to sell her luxury home to pay for her legal fees. I heard she moved to a small apartment in the city, the very place I had fled from. There was a poetic justice in that. The ranch began to thrive. With the help of the university, I turned part of the land into an educational center. I taught local kids about the history of the valley and the importance of the land. My grandfather's barn was finally painted, not because an HOA told me to, but because I wanted it to look beautiful. I painted it a deep crimson red that could be seen from miles away. It stood as a beacon of independence. One morning I was out in the field when I saw a car pull up to the gate. It was not a luxury SUV. It was an old truck. A man stepped out and introduced himself as one of the neighbors Barbara had bullied years ago. He thanked me for standing up to her. He said he had almost lost his family farm because of her fines. He brought over a crate of fresh peaches as a gift. Slowly, the community began to heal. We started having Sunday barbecues at the ranch. The people who were once afraid to speak to me were now my closest friends. We formed a loose alliance to protect the valley from any future developers. We did not need an HOA to tell us how to live. We just needed to respect each other and the land. I often think back to that first day when Barbara marched onto my porch. I realized that she was not just a villain. She was a warning. She represented the idea that power and money can override the truth. But she was wrong. The truth is like the roots of the old oak trees on my property. It is deep and it is strong. You can try to chop it down or cover it with pavement, but it will always find a way to break through. My ranch is more than just dirt and wood now. It is a symbol. It is a reminder that one person can stand against a corrupt system and win. I spent the evening sitting by the fire looking at the old photos of my grandfather. I think he would be proud. He did not leave me a ranch just so I could have a house. He left it to me so I could learn what it means to be a steward of the earth. I am no longer the man who stared at a computer screen in a cubicle. I am a rancher. I am a protector. And as long as I am standing, no one will ever try to take this land again. The birds are singing again, and the air is clear. The valley is at peace. And for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The sun sets over the hills, and I know that tomorrow will be another day of hard work and fresh air. That is all I ever wanted. The battle is over, and the ranch remains. It is mine, and it always will be.